Hello, friends, and welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower, and today we have something special for you. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower, and this is part of our mini-series about Dien Bien Phu and China's first proxy war. Today I'm having the sort of problem that afflicts many professors, which is that every time I try to leave my well-fortified base to make solid contact with the enemy, I can't find them. They're like smoke. But as soon as I get a well-organized patrol, more than 500 meters from the wire of the university, we start taking fire from all directions that drives us back inside the perimeter. It's maddening. So instead, I'm just going to talk about hats today. The French army is a perpetual outlier. As a friend of the channel, Artillery Mike, somewhere in the Russo-Ukrainian theater, likes to say, the French army imitates no one and is imitated by nobody. It's true, especially in the department of hats. See, usually what happens is when a country loses a war, whatever hat they were wearing at the time suddenly becomes completely unfashionable. One of the examples that comes to mind is the Soviet Army's Afghanka, because it was associated with the loss of prestige and confidence in the Afghan war. It went out of fashion, which I think is too bad. I think it looked like a creditable, if typically aesthetically weird, attempt at a desert dry heat kind of bush hat. And I wish we had more access to them. I would love to try them out. I think the same thing is true for everything from the German Pickelhaube to the US Army's ugly green baseball hat from Vietnam days. When you lose a war, the first casualty is going to be whatever hat you were wearing. But somehow, France seems to buck this trend. France has been no stranger to military reversals and adventures in its colonial possessions that the Fifth Republic would probably rather forget about. But nevertheless, maybe because of French style, the hats don't die with the cause. Granted, I don't go to San Francisco and see the hipsters wearing kepi around, but who knows? It could happen one day. But maybe the most culturally influential piece of forgotten French military headwear is this thing, the chapeau de brousse modèle de 1949, the bush hat of 1949. I think it's fair to say that Westerners like me associate this hat with French Fourth Republic colonialism, namely the Indochina War and the Algerian War, neither of which are remembered today as popular or successful. But it's something about French exceptionalism that even though this hat symbolized those wars, it did not pass out of fashion. In fact, quite the contrary, my friends. For once, the losing side's hat didn't pass into historical ignominy, but survived and actually ended up becoming an American bourgeois yuppie fashion trend. The way I've heard this told, the model of 1949 bush hat was developed as much as anything as a replacement for the red beret of the paratroopers. Yes, amazingly, French paratroopers were reportedly wearing their red berets in combat in the jungles of Indochina. That's how much they treasured that as a status symbol. Well, as you can imagine, that particular fashion statement was also something of a target de la tête in combat, and even the paratroopers weren't proud enough that they would be willing to fight after their heads had been blown off. And so, for once, the French army decided it would make a meaningful fashion concession, as long as they could come up with something equally practical and cool as the red beret. That was the chapeau de brousse of 1949. Now, if you think that it looks like an Australian slouch hat, you are exactly right. The French had fought alongside the Anzacs both in North Africa and in the Southeast Asian theater. And the Anzacs were pretty impressive in everything that they did there. And so the French decided, maybe there's magic in their hat. The great revolutionary change that they made was the material. The Australian slouch hat was done in felt, and I bet that was very practical in a drier climate like Australia's. But in the dank environment of Indochina, that didn't work so well. The felt needed to be maintained in a way that just wasn't realistic in a Southeast Asian jungle. So the French did something daring that sounds paradoxical and dumb. They made it out of cotton. Yeah, they developed a waterproof hat out of cotton. What they did was stitch it densely. I'll give you close-ups that'll show you this better. Stitch it densely in a kind of curvilinear pattern that's been called a fingerprint pattern, and gave it such heft that you can actually shape the hat into a bunch of different ways. Now, because the French bush hat survived and spread throughout the former French Indochina and long outlasted every memory of French presence there, it features hugely in photographs and films about the decades of Southeast Asian war. And in those photographs, you'll see this thing being worn every which way. In that sense, it's very practical. You can kind of shape it into whatever you need. It became a symbol later on for the ARVNs, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And to an American like me, that's what we mostly associate it with. Here we can see some recruits who have been newly inducted into the South Vietnamese Army, and you can tell how excited they are. And there they are wearing those bush hats. The French gave it a snap to go up on the right side. Now, if you look closely at photos, especially of Australian slouch hats, you'll see that typically they're pinned up on the left. There are a few exceptions, and I'll try to show you an example of that too. But the reason I've been told is that in French Army drill, the rifle was to be slung on the right shoulder. In British and Commonwealth drill, ordinarily the rifle was slung on the left, except, I'm told, in certain Australian states. Australian friends, help us with that one in the comments. And so where the Australian hats typically are pinned up on the left to make room for the rifle to not knock the hat off your head, in the French case, it was made with a snap to pin up on the right. Many people would wear it like this, bound up on both sides using the neck strap. But if you look at films and photos, you'll see it worn all kinds of ways. My advice is run, don't walk, to a wonderful film on Amazon Prime called 317th Platoon. This is a re-release of an old 1960s French film made by, I believe, by Pierre Schoendorfer, who was a veteran of the Indochina War. And according to some of the friends of the channel, this has been called the most realistic war movie ever made. And there we meet a platoon of Cambodian soldiers who are shepherded by a French adjutant, or kind of like a warrant officer named Wilsdorf. And you'll see that the whole platoon, each man kind of wears the hat in his own weird fashion. Note how the hat isn't flat topped the way, say, like a modern Rothko kind of boonie hat would be, nor is it crush fitted in a concave way, at least not permanently, like a cowboy hat. It's a big dome, and the wearer molds it however he wants, and then remolds it at will, because of that weird cotton construction that will take a mold, but it's only temporary. By the way, in case you're thinking, what the hell kind of name is Wilsdorf for a French sergeant? Well, friends, it just so happens that the film explains that Wilsdorf is an Alsatian. He comes from the same part of France as my family, and their region, Alsace-Lorraine, was a kind of continual political football between France and the nascent German state. And so in Wilsdorf's youth, he grew up as a French citizen, and then early in World War II, Alsace was occupied by the Germans, and as a Volksdeutsch, a German-speaking non-German citizen who had been, quote-unquote, repatriated to the Reich, he was then inducted into the Wehrmacht and sent off to fight the Soviets. And so the character Wilsdorf that we meet is only in his early 30s, but he has a wealth of experience from a kind of past life fighting, not as Adjutant Wilsdorf, but as Unteroffizier Wilsdorf with the Wehrmacht. To American troops in Southeast Asia, who, let's be frank, as Americans probably lacked the historical consciousness to even know that the French had been through there before already, they looked at these hats and they figured that they must be attempts to sort of like ape an American style cowboy hat. And that's what they called them, Saigon cowboy hats. And among some American troops, these became kind of like a goofy fashion statement. And a lot of them were made privately in places like Saigon. I think there were American Air Force units in Southeast Asia that adopted privately made Saigon cowboy hats as their units, unofficially official unit headgear. Here's a photo that I found of American flyers with a Royal Australian Air Force flyer at a U.S. Air Base in Thailand. You'll see the American pilots who are on the right and left. They have their units, Saigon cowboy hats, worn that kind of Arvin style, pinned up at both sides. And you'll see the Australian with his official Royal Australian Air Force slouch hat. And you'll also notice, if you look carefully, that his is pinned up on the right. Again, I'm told that that's a peculiarity of certain Australian states. Go figure. Australians, help us, please. That heavy stitched cotton construction also gave these hats incredible durability. I mean, these things are bomb proof. In photos, you rarely see one of these hats that's not like just missing whole chunks. Some of them look like they've taken direct hits from a 105 howitzer, but there's just so much material that there's just no way to make this thing disintegrate. Incidentally, I've never worn this out in rain. I'm told that the French paratroopers complained that it was too heavy. And I believe that. This hat weighs 170 grams dry, so call that 6 ounces. It resists water pretty well, but if you did succeed at soaking this thing, I bet it would be about a pound on your head. Here at the Type 56 Ordnance Department, we don't just disseminate knowledge, we create it empirically. And that's why, in our laboratories, I've created this working model of a flooded artillery pit at Strong Point Isabel, safe behind barbed wire entanglements, represented by this child-proof fence. Our research question today is to determine, when you take the already heavy French bush hat model of 1949 and you fully submerge it, how much heavier does it get? Let's find out. You'll see that at over 500 grams, the hat has more than doubled its dry weight. Heavy or no, I certainly believe that this thing would not be fun to wear if you were working your way through dense brush. A strong wind will blow this thing off your head. If you're in a thicket, it's going to keep getting snagged and choking you if the neck strap is on your throat. Of course, with anything French, by the time Americans take it up, it stops being cool. And so the French army moved on to other kinds of headgear, to something more effective, if much uglier, namely that casquette bijard that we talked about last time. The thing that looks like a war crime cycling cap. That got its start with Bijard's troops in Indochina, and then it proliferated throughout the paratroop community in Algeria. Because, wow, I bet the girls go wild for those things. If this were any other empire, that would be the end of the story for this hat. We would just say, yeah, their empire had a good run. Then they got tossed in the ash can of imperialist history, and so long. But I don't know, maybe it's just something magic that attaches to any French fashion product. This thing then ended up in the pages of the Banana Republic catalog, where it sold like gangbusters. Like many pieces of milsurp, it made a little excursus through Israel and the IDF first. There was a time when the IDF was pretty richly stocked with stuff that came from the French army. Now, part of this is probably that the French army was involved with the IDF as early as the Suez Crisis, and the French were willing to go on being closer at times with the IDF than some of the Anglo countries were willing to be. France being that one large Western power that was only ambivalently aligned at all times with the Anglos. And so a little triangle of mutual aid and imitation grew up between the French army, the IDF, and also the South African Defense Force. We'll talk about that another time when we talk about other Chinese proxy wars. But my experience as a person who's done a lot of rucking in arid heat in my part of California, just thinks that it's no coincidence that the Israelis, the South Africans, and the French, who all knew a lot about men carrying heavy loads in dry heat, that they all replicated and traded gear among themselves sometimes. Well, one of the things that made its way from French military stores in Indochina and Algeria to the IDF were the French chapeau de brousse. They had proved their worth in a desert environment in Algeria, and the IDF just took them over. And you can find IDF examples out on eBay stamped with the Hebrew initials of the IDF. Now, at some point, the Israelis also moved on to other headgear, things that look like mushrooms and stuff, but that still was not the end of the line for the French chapeau de brousse, because in 1981, in San Francisco, there appeared something that could not possibly exist there today, and that is a fashion-forward store specializing in military surplus. Friends, that store was Banana Republic. What they used to do was buy up milsurp that looked to their eyes like it had fashion potential, and then they would ship it to San Francisco. Often they would retailer it, and they would brand the heck out of it in their like nice, quirky, insouciant Varis like catalog language. And a lot of this stuff would sell like hotcakes. So Banana Republic's buyers were in Israel, saw the IDF hats, and saw something that nobody else did, I guess, which was saleability. And they tried to buy up a huge store of these things from the IDF, who amazingly told them to get stupped. So the Banana Republic buyers like wheedled and wheedled with the IDF, and they were flatly turned down. And so they bought one specimen of this old IDF bush hat from someone, took it to Hong Kong, and got somebody to make up a large number of knockoffs. And they became a signature item from Banana Republic that's it must have been made in so many copies that on eBay you can still find them all over the place. Is it the best jungle or desert hiking headgear? No. Even for a retro item, I would give that award to the SADF bucket hat any day. And will it get the girls like it did in 1981? Probably not. But if you're like me and you're already happily married to a wonderful woman who countenances all kinds of eccentric and antiquarian behavior, you just might want a French bush hat or a cheap imitation of it from Banana Republic. Friends, this has been a decidedly unmilitary episode of Type 56, the story of China's army. If you like this sort of content, or at least the kind of content that we normally do, please like and subscribe. You might even visit our Patreon page, which helps both to fill the strategic hat fund with important headgear and also to keep the political officer, Mrs. 56, sweet about her husband doing these videos instead of childcare. Friends, I can't wait to see you next time.